Hi, this is Phil Leach. What I'd like to do is to talk through the handout Titus, his travels, and Paul. The idea is to explore what we can discover about Titus in his relationship to Paul and as one of Paul's apostolic team. Now, most of Paul's companions we really do not know a lot about. Maybe Priscilla and Aquila we can know a little. The most is probably Timothy. But there are some things we can discover about Titus too. You'll notice that the first reference I have there is from Galatians chapter 2 verse 3. And this is a rather informative reference. We find here in this paragraph that Paul is speaking about how he and Barnabas went up to the apostles in Jerusalem. That is Peter, John and James. And he went up to present his gospel to them, as he says in this passage, to make sure he wasn't running in vain. Now, how this fits in, we'll see in the next book when we study Galatians. But as Paul is talking about that visit, he mentions Titus. You'll notice he says how after 14 years he went up to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with him. And what he says there in verse 3 of chapter 2, but even Titus, who was with me, was not compelled to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. And so this little piece of information is interesting. Firstly, Titus is a Gentile, he's a Greek, and he was uncircumcised. Now, this visit, after 14 years, again we'll explore this more in our study of Galatians, but the after 14 years there, it gives a date of either 46 or 49, AD 46 or 49. So we know that from fairly early on in Paul's ministry, Titus was with him and part of his team. And then that's all we hear. We actually don't find Titus mentioned in the book of Acts at all. Only in the letters. And so, if we think of Paul's ongoing missionary adventures, after this visit to Jerusalem, if it was in AD 46, after that we have Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary journey in Acts 13 and 14. And then we have in chapter 15 the Council of Jerusalem. Now, some would argue that this visit in chapter 2 of Galatians is the same visit as in chapter 15. And if that's the case, then Titus was around then and as part of that visit to Jerusalem. But we hear nothing of Titus in the second missionary journey, and in the third missionary journey is where we see Titus mentioned again. As I said, not in the book of Acts, but in 2 Corinthians. Now, the whole Corinthian correspondence is quite a complex discussion, and we will be talking about that when we study 1 and 2 Corinthians. But just to note that when Paul is writing in his second letter, he talks about Titus in chapter 7. In chapter 7 verse 6 we read, "But God who consoles the downcast consoled us by the arrival of Titus." To cut a long story short, there are a number of letters that Paul wrote to the church in Corinth. We only have 2 of them. And one of those letters which we don't have, which is lost to us, Paul speaks about in chapter 2 of 2 Corinthians as a painful letter. And this painful letter, it seemed, was delivered by Titus as Paul's delegated authority. Paul's courier. And when that letter was sent to the church at Corinth, Paul was very anxious as to how the church would receive it, whether it would be received well or not. And after spending some more time in Ephesus, where the letter was sent from, we read that Paul then moved to Macedonia. And there he waits for Titus. And after a while he meets Titus, probably at Philippi, and was comforted. And this is what's being referred to here in chapter 7, verse 6. And then Paul sends what we call 2 Corinthians with Titus back to Corinth to prepare them for Paul's visit, and also to prepare the gift that Paul was raising to go to the church in Judea. And this is during AD 55 or AD 55-56. And then we hear nothing more of Titus. As we follow Paul, we find that he then, after the third missionary journey, journeys to Jerusalem. He's arrested. He spends 2 years in prison in Caesarea, and then he makes his journey to Rome. And as discussed in the coursework, it would seem that the Apostle Paul was released after this imprisonment, and the number of pointers towards this, although the New Testament doesn't actually say. The book of Acts finishes by saying that Paul spent 2 years under house arrest in Rome. But tradition and the scriptural evidence would point to the fact that Paul was released and went on a further missionary journey. Whether he reached Spain or not is up for discussion. But it would seem that it was in this further travels that Titus and 1st and 2nd Timothy were written. And so during this time, we find Paul and Titus in Crete, and then Titus joining Paul in Nicopolis, as we've discovered in the letter to Titus. The last reference we have of Titus is in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 10, and it's just a passing comment that Titus has been sent to Dalmatia. And so 2 Timothy, it does seem to be Paul's last letter. He's in prison, and it does seem from the tone of the letter that he was not going to get out. It seems that this imprisonment was a different imprisonment than the one we have at the end of Acts. And in 2 Timothy, he was expecting to be executed. And tradition has Paul executed in Rome in the period of between AD 65 and 67. And so this is the very brief outline that we can have of Titus and his relationship with Paul throughout Paul's ministry.